Hey guys, this is going to be really quick, short and sweet ASMR video of me reading a childhood favourite book. This book is the BFG by Roald Dahl. And I loved almost all of his books growing up, and although my taste has changed quite a bit, I still find his stories really fun to read. So here goes. And excuse the snoring, that is my little kitty. Well, he's not so little anymore, but he loves to sit by my feet, and he's refused to move, so you have wonderful snoring sounds in the background. Okay. So this is the BFG by Roald Dahl. The Witching Hour. Sophie couldn't sleep. A brilliant moonbeam was slanting through a gap in the curtains. It was shining right on her pillow. The other children in the dormitory had been asleep for hours. Sophie closed her eyes and lay quiet still. She tried very hard to doze off. It was no good. The moonbeam was like a silver blade slicing through the room to her face. The house was absolutely silent. No voices came up from downstairs. There were no footsteps on the floor above either. The window behind the curtain was wide open. Nobody was walking on the pavement outside. No cars went on the street. Not the tiniest of sounds could be heard anywhere. Sophie had never known such a silence. Perhaps, she told herself, this is what they call the witching hour. The witching hour, somebody had once whispered to her, was a special moment in the middle of the night when every child and every grown-up was in a deep, deep sleep, and all the dark things came out from hiding and had the world to themselves. The moonbeam was brighter than ever on Sophie's pillow. She decided to get out of bed and close the gap in the curtains. You got punished if you were caught out of bed after lights out. Even if you said you had to go to the lavatory, that was not accepted as an excuse, and they punished you just the same. But there was no one about now. Sophie was sure of that. She reached out for her glasses that lay on the chair beside the bed. They had steel rims and very thick lenses. She could hardly see a thing without them. She put them on, then slipped out of bed and tiptoed over to the window. When she reached the curtains, Sophie hesitated. She longed to duck underneath them and lean out of the window to see what the world looked like now that the witching hour was at hand. She listened again. Everything was deathly still. The longing to look out became so strong she couldn't resist it. Quickly she ducked under the curtains and leaned out of the window. In the silvery moonlight, the village street she knew so well seemed completely different. The houses looked bent and crooked, like houses in a fairy tale. Everything was pale and ghostly and milky white. across the road she could see Mrs. Rance's shop, where she bought buttons and wool and bits of elastic. It didn't look real. There was something dim and misty about that too. Sophie allowed her eyes to travel further and further down the street. Suddenly she froze. There was something coming up the street on the opposite side. It was something black. Something tall and blank. Something very tall and very black and very thin. Who? It wasn't a human. It couldn't be. It was 4 times as tall as the tallest human. It was so tall its head was higher than the upstairs window of the houses. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat, like her whole body, was frozen with fright. This was the witching hour, all right. The tall black figure was coming her way. It was keeping very close to the houses across the street, hiding in the shadowy places where there was no moonlight. On it came, nearer and nearer. But it was moving in spurts. It would stop, then it would move on, then it would stop again. But what on earth was it doing? Aha! Sophie could see now what it was up to. It was stopping in front of each house. It would stop and peer into the upstairs window of each house in the street. It actually had to bend down to peer into the upstairs windows. That's how tall it was. It would stop and peer in, then it would slide onto the next house and stop again and peer in, and so on, all along the street. It was much closer now, and Sophie could see it more clearly. Looking at it carefully, she decided that it had been some kind of person. Obviously it was not a human, but it was definitely a person. A giant person, perhaps. Sophie stared hard across the misty, moonlit street. The giant, if that's what he was wearing a long black cloak. In one hand it was holding what looked like a very long, thin trumpet. On the other hand he held a large suitcase. The giant had stopped right in front of Mr. and Mrs. Gucci's house. The Gucci's had a greengrocer's shop in the middle of the high street, and the family lived above the shop. The 2 Gucci children slept in the upstairs front room. Sophie knew that. The giant was peering through the window into the room where Michael and Jane Gucci were sleeping. From across the street, Sophie watched and held her breath. She saw the giant step back a pace and put the suitcase down on the pavement. He bent down and opened the suitcase. He took something out of it. It looked like a glass jar, one of those square ones with the screwed top. He unscrewed the top of the jar and poured what was in it into the end of a long trumpet thing. Sophie watched, trembling. She saw the giant straighten up again. She saw him poke the trumpet in through the open upstairs window of the room where the Gucci children were sleeping. She saw the giant take a deep breath and blew through the trumpet. No noise came out, but it was obvious to Sophie that whatever had been in the jar had now been blown through the trumpet into the Gucci's children's bedroom. What could it be? As the giant withdrew the trumpet from the window and bent down to pick up the suitcase, he happened to turn his head and glance across the street. In the moonlight, Sophie caught a glimpse of an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face with the most enormous ears. The nose was as sharp as a knife, and above the nose there were two bright, flashing eyes, and the eyes were staring straight at Sophie. There was a fierce, devilish look about them. Sophie gave a yelp and pulled back from the window. She fell across the dormitory and jumped into her bed and hid under the blanket. And there she crouched, still as a mouse and tingly all over. The snatch. Under the blanket, Sophie waited. After a minute or so, she lifted a corner of the blanket and peeped out. For a second time that night, her blood froze to ice, and she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. There, at the window with the curtains pulled aside, was the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of the giant person staring in. The flashing black eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking in through the window. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking in through the window. This was followed by an arm as thick as a tree trunk, and the arm, the hand, the fingers were reaching out across towards Sophie's bed. This time, Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because very quickly the huge hand clamped down over the blanket, and the scream was smothered by the bedclothes. Sophie, crouching underneath the blanket, felt strong fingers grasping hold of her, and then she was lifted up from the bed, blanket and all, and whisked out of the window. If you can think of anything more terrifying than that happening to you in the middle of the night, then let's hear about it. The awful thing was that Sophie knew exactly what was going on, although she couldn't see it happening. She knew that the monster, or giant, with an enormous, pale, wrinkly face and dangerous eyes, had plucked her from her bed in the middle of the witching hour, and now carrying her out through the window, smothered in a blanket. What actually happened next was this. When the giant had got Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so that he could grasp all four corners of it at once in one of his huge hands, with Sophie imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized the suitcase and the long trumpet thing, and off he ran. Sophie, by squirming around inside the blanket, managed to push the top of her head through a little gap just below the giant's hand. She stared around. She saw the village houses rushing by on both sides. A giant was sprinting down the high street. He was running so fast, his black cloak was streaming out behind him like the wings of a bird. Each stride he took was so long as a tennis court. Out of the village he ran, and soon they were racing across the moonlit fields. The hedges dividing the fields were no problem to the giant. He simply strode over them. A wide river appeared in his path. He crossed it in one flying stride. Sophie crouched in the blanket, peering out. She was being bumped against the giant's leg like a sack of potatoes. Over the fields and hedges and rivers they went, and after a while a frightening thought came into Sophie's head. The giant is running fast, she told herself. He is hungry and he wants to get home as quickly as possible, and then he'll have me for breakfast. The cave. The giant ran on and on, but now a curious change took place in his way of running. He seemed suddenly to go on into a higher gear. Faster and faster he went, and soon he was travelling at such a speed that the landscape became a blur. The wind stung Sophie's cheeks. It made her eyes water. It whipped her head back and whistled in her ears. She could no longer feel the giant's feet touching the ground. She had a weird sensation they were flying. It was impossible to tell whether they were over land or sea. This giant had some sort of magic in his legs. The wind rushing against Sophie's face became so strong that she had to duck down again into the blanket to prevent her head from being blown away. Was it really possible that they were crossing oceans? It certainly felt that way to Sophie. She crouched into the blanket and listened to the howling of the wind. It went on for what seemed hours. Then, all at once, the wind stopped its howling. The pace began to slow down. Sophie could feel the giant's feet pounding again over the earth. She poked her head out of the blanket to have a look. They were in a country of thick forests and rushing rivers. The giant had definitely slowed down. He was running more normally, although normal was a silly word to use to describe a galloping giant. He leaped over a dozen rivers. He went rattling through a great forest, then down into a valley and up over a range of hills as bare as concrete. And as soon as he was galloping over a desolate wasteland that was not quite of this earth, the ground was flat and pale yellow. Great lumps of blue rock were scattered around, and dead trees stood everywhere like skeletons. The moon had long since disappeared now, and the dawn was breaking. Sophie, still peering out of the blanket, saw suddenly ahead of her a great crazy mountain. The mountain was dark blue, and all around it the sky was gushing and glistening with light. Bits of pale gold were flying among delicate frosty white flakes of cloud, and over to one side of the rim of the morning sun was coming up red as blood. Right beneath the mountain the giant stopped. He was puffing mightily. His great chest was heaving in and out. He paused to catch his breath. Directly in front of them, laying aside the side of the mountain, Sophie could see a massive round stone. It was as big as a house. The giant reached out and rolled the stone to one side as easily as it had been a football, and now, where the stone had been, appeared a vast black hole. The hole was so large the giant didn't even have to duck his head as he went in. He strode into the black hole, carrying Sophie in one hand, the trumpet and the suitcase in the other. As soon as he was inside, he stopped and turned and rolled the great stone back into place, so that the entrance to his secret cave was completely hidden from outside. Now that the entrance had been sealed up, there was not a glint of light inside the cave. All was black. Sophie felt herself lowered to the ground. Then the giant let go of the blanket completely. His footsteps moved away. Sophie sat there in the dark, shivering with fear. He was getting ready to eat me, she told herself. He'll probably eat me raw, just as I am. Or perhaps he'll boil me first. Or he will have me fried. He will drop me like rashers of bacon into some gigantic frying pan sizzling with fat. A bizarre light suddenly lit up the whole place. Sophie blinked and stared. She saw an enormous cavern with a high rocky roof. The walls on either side were lined with shelves, and on the shelves there stood row upon row of glass jars. They were just jars everywhere. They were piled up in the corners. They filled every nook and cranny of the cave. In the middle of the floor there was a table 12 feet high and a chair to match. The giant took off his black cloak and hung it against the wall. Sophie saw that under the cloak he was wearing a sort of colourless shirt and a dirty old leather waistcoat that didn't seem to have any buttons. His trousers were faded green and were far too long in the legs. On his bare feet he was wearing a pair of ridiculous sandals that for some reason had holes cut along each side, with the large hole at the end where his toes stuck out. Sophie, crouching on the floor of the cave in her nightie, gazed back at him through thick steel-rimmed glasses. She was trembling like a leaf in the wind, and a finger of ice was running up and down the length of her spine. "Ha!" shouted the giant, walking forward and rubbing his hands together. "What has us got here?" His booming voice rolled around the walls of the cave like a burst of thunder. That's it for now, guys, and if you enjoyed, please feel free to comment and let me know, and if you'd like me to continue this really wonderful story, then as well, please let me know in the comments. Thank you very much